Well, welcome everyone to another edition of the Civil War Museum's monthly engagement known as Coffee and Hardtack. We feature Civil War historians, authors, people working in the public history realm, just doing interesting and great work in the era of Civil War, memory, and Reconstruction. Today, we're really glad to have Dr. Brian Matthew Jordan with us to talk about his latest book, A Thousand May Fall, Life, Death, and Survival in the Union Army. Dr. Jordan is Assistant Professor of History and the Director of Graduate Studies in History at Sam Houston State University, where he teaches courses on the Civil War and Reconstruction, American military history, and the U.S. History Survey. He's written extensively, as I said. Past books include Marching Home, Union Veterans, and Their Unending Civil War. And you'll also see him in various Civil War publications as he's written more than 80 articles, reviews, and essays, and they've appeared in journals such as the Journal of the Civil War Era, Civil War History, and the New York Times. Dr. Jordan is a native of Akron, Ohio, and he's also a graduate of Gettysburg College and Yale University. Dr. Jordan, we're so glad to have you with us, and we're looking forward to your discussion about your latest book.
Doug, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you all.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Now, your newest book details the history of the 107th Ohio, and that regiment was largely made up of German immigrants living in Northeast Ohio before the war. From your study, did patterns emerge as to why these immigrants, why these men new to this country would enlist to fight for the Union cause?
It's a great question. Enlistment motivations in the 107th Ohio actually defy any neat categorization. They were as diverse as the men themselves. But there are a few patterns that we can point to. For many soldiers, this was an opportunity, a welcome opportunity to fight in an ethnic regiment. The 107th was the fifth of 6 ethnically German regiments mustered from the state of Ohio. So the opportunity to go off and fight with men who spoke the same language and shared the same heritage and cultural traditions, that was alluring. So too was the promise, right, that they would go off and fight Schmidt-Siegel, the famous revolutionary emigre who had a peerless charm among German-American immigrants in this period. Some soldiers, right, they wanted to follow in the footsteps of revered ancestors who had martial traditions. Some others even saw in the Secession War, right, parallels with the old democratic revolutions of 1848. They saw this as a continuation of those old struggles against tyranny and aristocracy. Some were committed Big R Republicans, came out of the Turner Clubs in Cleveland and in other places, and these were really committed anti-slavery radicals. There's a contingent of troops from the town of Zor on the Tuscarawas River, which was a pacifist communitarian society. This contingent, right, they set aside the conscientious objection of their families back home and really saw in this war an emancipation crusade that they couldn't sit out. But for others, right, pecuniary motives appealed more powerfully than patriotism. This is a unit that, despite its anti-slavery convictions, despite its associations with the Republican Party, was also amply stocked with Democrats, pre-war Democrats. So it's really quite a melange. It's quite a mix, and I think that's pretty typical of a lot of these Midwestern units.
Now, here in Wisconsin, obviously the 26th Wisconsin has kind of a parallel history, I think, to the 107th, and with Milwaukee being such a staunchly German immigrant community, was Cleveland the same way? Did Cleveland attract a lot of German immigrants to the upper Midwest before the war?
It certainly did. Cleveland is one of the largest communities that would supply men for the 107th. And of course, in Ohio, you also have Cincinnati that becomes a locus of ethnic German immigration as well during this period. So a lot of recently arrived folks who are immigrating in the 1850s.
Now, the regiment became part of the 11th Corps and fought at both Chancellorsville and Gettysburg in the late spring and summer of 1863. Now, both of those battles, the 107th and the 11th Corps, fought bravely, but were forced to retreat and received a lot of criticism nationally for that. And that also spurned a lot of anti-German, anti-immigrant feelings across the United States. In your research, how did you find that this criticism affected the regiment?
It affected them very deeply, and you can see that indexed in the letters that they would send back to local newspapers, tart letters defending exactly what they had done on the Orange Turnpike at Chancellorsville, atop Blocker's Knoll at Gettysburg. They insisted that they fought as hard as any troop similarly deployed could have. They wielded, and I think this is pretty remarkable, they wielded their casualty registers as evidence of what they had withstood. And in the process of writing these letters, in making these very public appeals, in responding to the charges of nativism and the just the awful attacks that were made on these soldiers, they actually clarified the nature of their commitment to the Union cause. And I think it gave them a certain sense of who they were as soldiers, and served to sharpen their sense of regimental identity. This was something they also enlisted the support of the larger German American community in. There were mass meetings, of course, that summer after Chancellorsville that gavelled to order in places like New York City and places like Cleveland, where the German American community would come together and defend what these soldiers had done, and really place the blame squarely where it belonged, at the foot of the native-born leadership that had left these men hanging out to dry.
How about at home? Did the criticism of the 107th affect how maybe some German assimilation within the communities of Ohio? Did it affect how they looked at the war politically, or how they were, assimilating into American culture?
I think it did. And I think, the 107th, I described them in the book as men betwixt and between, men who belonged but did not. And, this fits into larger debates that historians have had of late about the experiences of immigrant soldiers more broadly. We once kind of embraced this notion that Civil War service was a means toward Americanization, or a means toward assimilation. That was certainly the idea put forth in William Burton's classic book on ethnic regiments, Melting Pot Soldiers. More recently, scholars like Christian Keller and others have been more skeptical of this notion, and have suggested that Civil War service was not a means toward a neat assimilation. And I would certainly agree more with Keller. Certainly the experiences of the 107th Ohio left them feeling a deep sting of betrayal. They felt as though their services and sacrifices were not appropriately recognized and honored. Of course, there were some who did feel differently, and that's not to say that all civilians back home in Ohio treated this unit that way, but the overwhelming sense that they had by 1864 especially is that what they were sacrificing was not being recognized, and that they had been handled very badly, that they had a monopoly on misfortune.
Your book talks a lot about the civilian population back in Ohio, and what struck me was the way in which people at home received news about Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Here we are in this era of, we know exactly what happened, when it happened, the instant that it happened. And can you describe to us the process that people went through to receive news of their loved ones who may be serving in that 11th Corps? They know that a battle happened somewhere in Northern Virginia or in central Pennsylvania, and they're just at home agonizing, waiting for that news about a loved one, what their fate was, what happened. Can you talk about the process of how they would have gotten that information?
Yeah, it's a fitful, sporadic, and imperfect traffic of kind of real-time rumors and reports. And newspaper editors are slowly wringing together a coherent chronicle of events from these hasty reports on the battlefield. A lot of Local newspapers, of course, couldn't afford war correspondents. They couldn't dispatch a journalist into the field. And so local newspapers are dependent upon what the telegraphs are clacking furiously in the aftermath of these battles. It's often notoriously inaccurate. There are plenty of examples, notorious examples of soldiers, for instance, reading their own obituaries. And so sometimes, right, a coherent picture of what had actually happened takes weeks, sometimes months. Sometimes it never even emerges during the war itself. And the civilians back home are really impatient. I'm thinking of the men and women of Norwalk, Ohio, one of the communities that feeds men into the 107th, right up along the shores of Lake Erie. They actually dispatch a delegation to Gettysburg in the weeks after that battle to look after the sick and wounded and to kind of survey the situation on the ground to get a sense of what has actually happened. A lot of communities, of course, didn't have the means or the wherewithal to dispatch those search parties. And so they wait for letters from the men themselves. And these letters that come back that supply kind of real-time information. They attempt to provide something like a narrative of the battle, but they so often devolve into these tedious catalogs of injuries, right, of the local men back home. And that's this kind of the imperfect way that they receive this news. We, from the perspective of 150 years, from the perspective of perfect hindsight, we of course know how it turned out, and we forget about these anxious moments where families and even sometimes the men themselves are just trying to piece together what exactly has happened.
You talk about the letters that were sent back home, the newspaper coverage, rich primary sources, I'm sure, for the book. Where did those sources exist? Where did you mine them? What was the process of the research for the book?
So local newspapers, I can't speak highly enough of their importance to this kind of work, to reviving regimental histories. Local newspapers are amazing troves of soldier letters. And in the case of the 107th Ohio, it was the single most indispensable source for soldiers' voices. There are very few letters from the 107th in archives and libraries, so you really have to go to those local papers to find their voices. Add to that the records of the unit in the National Archives, the regimental order books, the disciplinary records, the pension files. Getting at these sources can kind of give you a picture of what is happening. And these, I think, both those sources in the National Archives and local newspapers have been underexploited by scholars who have typically relied on regimental histories or letters and diaries and other manuscript collections. But if you get at these kind of underused, underexploited pools of sources, some new voices can be amplified and some new perspectives can be gained.
Now, after the summer of 1863, the 107th was sent south to South Carolina and Florida. They're not exactly the main stage anymore. How did the regiment view that? Did they view it as kind of we're being punished for this, or did they welcome the change? What was the reaction?
It was no doubt seen as a slight, right? The 11th Corps, which had found the thick of the killing at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, is no longer a fighting unit. Some of the men are sent into the Western Theater. The boys of the 107th and some of their comrades are sent down to the Department of the South. And this is perceived as a great slight. They are deprived of the opportunity to ever again prove their mettle in a major battle. They're made to swat at gluttonous mosquitoes and prowl about on remote picket lines under drooping palmettos in the rice swamps of South Carolina and the swamps of Florida. They're really relegated to the margins of the war at the very moment, of course, that Grant and Sherman are making progress in Virginia and in Georgia, and they're resentful of that. They come to abandon any sense of military ceremony. They no longer polish their muskets or fold their gum blankets or snap to attention at drill. They really start to openly question the perspicacity of the war's leaders, the should this war go on? In 1864, they became the only Ohio unit to cast a plurality of its ballots for George McClellan in the race against Abraham Lincoln, which is a pretty remarkable measure, I think, of what they're feeling about the war by 1864.
Now, when the war ended and the 107th returned home, how were they received in their communities? And do you get the sense that we kind of just talked about this with their voting and what happened in the election of 1864, but do you get a sense that it changed their view about America and really what motivated them to make the move in the first place?
Reintegration was terribly difficult for these men. They're not only contending with a litany of physical, psychological, and emotional scars that make the return to civilian life. All of these things combine to make the return to civilian life rather difficult. But they're also dealing with communities back home that have reached no consensus about the meaning of the war or their participation in it. Communities that continue to heap aspersions on these ethnic soldiers. They're still, as late as the 1890s, be attempting to clear their name. When the first histories of the Battle of Chancellorsville are published, they're writing to the authors and the editors, still trying to clear their name for what had happened in the wake of Stonewall Jackson's flank attack. So it's a lifelong struggle for these men. Some will come back and they'll be able to lead civically engaged and meaningful and productive lives. I'm thinking of one of the main characters in the book, Captain George Billow, who goes on to establish a funeral home in Northeast Ohio. It becomes one of the leaders in the embalming industry in Ohio. Major Augustus Vignos establishes a cutlery company in Canton, Ohio. Alfred Ryder, who had been the regimental postmaster, appropriately enough, gets a plum patronage job in Washington, D.C. In the post office, and he's a supervisor in the mailbag department of the U.S. Post Office. So some of these men do very well and lead civically engaged lives. But even if you look, there's kind of a public facade, right? If you look into the pension files, if you look into the personal correspondence, there's that private anguish and there's that private agony that often went unspoken, but that they carried through for the rest of their lives, never able to put behind them the scenes of what had happened out there at the Tally Farm or at Blockers Knoll, the sounds of the wounded, the anguish that they had endured. That stayed with them for the rest of their lives. And that was something that civilians were just hopeless to understand.
Well, Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us this morning about your latest work, A Thousand May Fall, Life, Death, and Survival in the Union Army. Just as an aside, we will be reading Dr. Jordan's work for the November Media Club through the Civil War Museum, and we're very hopeful about getting Brian out to join us in person in 2022 for one of our symposiums. So we're anxious for that. Brian, we'll get you out here to the Midwest, get you back back in the Big Ten states, and we're looking forward to that opportunity, and we wish you all the best going forward, and please stay in touch.
All right, thank you so much, Doug.
Take care.